Here we are. Here's our
I
friend.
think I finally made it. God.
It's not your fault. Yeah, you weren't under Radio Renaissance. You were under a different name.
Oh, heavens, heavens. I'm many things to many people.
Yes. Well, welcome, Jared. How are you today?
Yeah. Well, I'm doing very well. And I'm glad to know the problem was not a geezer boomer problem. It was a problem at
No,
your end.
it's a Substack problem. It's a very interesting platform. They have a lot of kinks, but they have very good customer service too. I reach out to them, and usually they fix it. So these things are
Hmm.
always getting better. And
Okay.
Substack is great because it'll automatically make a video. We can have clips. We'll be able to blast it out to the world as soon as
Wonderful.
this is done.
Wonderful. Well, before we do anything, I do want to thank you for urging X to take me back. I thought that was very gallant of you. I know we disagree on so many things, and this kind of principled idea of no, no, we don't suppress people with whom we disagree, we debate them. I think that's very civilized, and I appreciate that very much.
Well, yeah, I was glad to do it. I'm not a person who's like just a complete absolutist on these matters. Like there are some accounts that are just racial slurs and harassing people all day, and if those
Mm.
people want to get booted off social media, I say, they're not really contributing much to the discussion. But you're a gentleman, you're a nice man. You don't curse at people, you don't insult them. Yeah, there's no reason that other people should be on the platform, and you
I,
shouldn't. So
I,
I'm fine.
I
I'm glad you
see.
got your back.
I see you set the bar pretty low. No, I don't curse and rant. I
Well, I
should
mean,
think,
on the new Elon Musk X, I mean, yeah, I think the bar is pretty low because I think that, that's like half of Twitter right now.
yes,
How did
yes.
you get back, by the way? I tried to get them to reinstate the old account, but it looks like you just created a new one.
My lips are sealed. Ask me no questions, I'll tell you no lies.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, however it happened, you're back. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
glad to see that. Um,
Thank you.
And so yeah, let's just sort of dive right into like the issues of the day. Do you still call yourself a white nationalist or do you call yourself a white identitarian? How do you self-identify?
No, I have never called myself a white nationalist. Not necessarily because I am not, but the term nationalist, like a Basque nationalist or a Kurdish nationalist, it has a kind of a bomb throwing perfume to it, which I
Mhm.
completely reject. I call myself a white advocate and a race realist. I advocate for the people of my race, like so many people of different races do for their races.
And do you think that yeah, I guess that makes sense. We don't call Al Sharpton a black nationalist. You could call him a black nationalist, but right, that's not. So yeah, if we want symmetry here, we could
Yeah.
say a white advocate. Um, do you think that historically the groups that have had activists on their behalf, has that been the path towards success and prosperity? I mean, has that worked out well for blacks, do you think, since the 1960s? Or is racial activism perhaps something that groups don't necessarily need?
Oh, blacks clearly think they need it, and they have benefited tremendously for it in terms of racial preferences, for example, and other racial groups in this country. They have lobbied very, very hard for open borders, at least for their people, and to that extent, they've benefited enormously. Now, the reason why there never was the equivalent of a white advocate in the past is that no one ever found the necessity even for the word. The idea that white people in America assumed that this was a country built by white people as an outpost of Europe, no one ever doubted that. And that was going to be the way it was going to be right until the end of eternity. And if, I'm sure, you had told the people in 1965 who were voting in Congress for the Immigration Act that completely began this transformation of the demographics of the United States, if you'd told them, look, you vote for this law, and in about 80, 90 years, whites will be a minority, they would have said, hell no, we ain't doing it. So this was taken for granted right from the very founding of the United States that this was essentially a European country.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the issue is when you say someone is a white activist, that could mean a whole lot of things, and white people disagree on issues of public policy and philosophy, just like other people do. So if you say you're a white activist, you could be
Advocate, yes,
yeah, advocate. Okay. Well, what's the
yes.
difference? What do you see this difference between advocate and activist?
Well, if we really want to split hairs, an activist I see as someone who is out in the world organizing, making groups, who may be dropping banners. I really just sit in my room and stare at a keyboard and make videos and talk to people. So
Uh,
you can be an activist, you can be an advocate without really being an activist. But it's two different ways of advancing, I think, the legitimate interests of whites.
okay. Um, Okay, fair enough. So, yeah. So when you say you're a white advocate, um, that could be anything, right? So you could be a communist and be a white advocate, presumably,
Sure.
as long as you don't believe
Sure.
in redistribution to other races. You could be a fundamentalist capitalist. You could be a socialist. You could be
Yeah.
anything in between. You could be an environmentalist, or you could be sort of in the pocket of the oil and gas lobby. You can have a positive view of fossil fuels or a negative view of fossil fuels. Um,
Yes.
why not just have these debates? Why have white advocacy as its own specific project?
Well, that's a very fundamental question. And to ask the question, it seems to me, is almost to misread the current situation, not only in the United States, but in the entire world. Every national group and every racial group has an instinctive loyalty to that group. And you see this wherever you look. We have Black activists or Black advocates. We have Hispanics. We have Asians. Just take the United States Congress. You have a Black Congressional Congress. What's its job? Its job is to examine legislature and to examine laws and say, what's in it for us? What's in it for the brothers? It's the same for the Hispanic caucus, the Asian caucus, but whites are not expected to have any interests. We are the only ones who are forbidden to have any group interests because that makes us white supremacists, that makes us Nazis, that makes us socially, utterly undesirable and worse, and banned from Twitter. So there is a tremendous there's a tremendous asymmetry. When every other group has an instinctive fellow feeling and wishes to link arms to advance their interests, and if sometimes at our expense, if whites are merely individuals, then we would be taken advantage of by people who are very successfully pushing their interests, often at our expense.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's right. So it's a point that everyone else has their group interest. So it's a very basic argument that if somebody advocates for blacks and someone advocates for Hispanics, whites will be sort of left out in the cold. And
Well, it's
you know,
unilateral disarmament.
yeah, but I mean, there's also another way of looking at it. So there are people who disagree with white activism, white advocacy, and also disagree with black advocacy and Hispanic advocacy. And the question is like having whites act more like blacks and Hispanics. Is that going to have a positive effect for whites? Maybe okay, they get rid of affirmative action, so they've done a few things that are clearly in white interests.
Yeah.
Um, but is seeing public policies through a racial prism, is this necessarily the best way to go forward just because other groups see things in that way? So I'll give you, for example, a sort of a concrete interest story. So like something like 40-50% of American Fortune 500 CEOs, you look at Pence, you look at Nobel Prize winners, like something like 40-50% of them are foreign born. Some of those are white. Many of those are from India or China or Israel, if you consider whether or not you consider Israel a white country. And from my perspective, shutting off immigration, high skilled immigration, would have a major impact on whites and blacks and Hispanics. It's not necessarily zero sum. If we let in Elon Musk, for example, Elon Musk came from South Africa, maybe under a immigration restrictionist policy. South Africa would be considered a black country. Let's say Elon Musk doesn't get into the country. We don't have SpaceX, we don't have Tesla, so on and so forth. We don't have the free speech on X because nobody buys it and lets you come back. Um, and so that wouldn't be in white interest. It wouldn't be in black interest. It wouldn't be in Hispanic interest if I think Elon Musk didn't come to America. The same with the founder of NVIDIA named Jensen Huang. He's a child of Taiwanese immigrants and has created remarkable value for the country. So, what about the argument that you could advocate for white interests? You end up seeing this world through a racial lens, and you end up sort of shooting yourself in the foot because you adopt these illiberal policies like restricting immigration based on race, for example.
Well, first of all, you're looking at it strictly from an economic point of view. I believe that a nation is far more than GNP per capita. You may believe that human beings are atomized individuals and they are in it for themselves, and their idea is to make as much money as possible. That's not the way I think. That's not the way most humans think. And if you want to transform Homo sapiens into strictly an economic animal, that might make sense. But most human beings have what you might consider irrational attachments. The most obvious irrational attachment is to your own family. You love your children more than you love the children of strangers because they're yours, not necessarily because they are objectively superior. This is a natural, healthy feeling. And for most people, the largest group to which they feel a kind of instinctive loyalty is their extended racial family. Their race is their largest extended family. You find this throughout the world. And it is only whites who have been traditionally extremely individualistic, who have adapted precisely the argument you're making about the nature of their society. They didn't used to do this. At first, when the United States was founded, it was founded as an explicitly white country. And as you know, the very first citizenship law in the United States passed by the very first Congress. It's a brand new country, deciding who's going to live here, what's it going to be like. And they said naturalization was going to be restricted to free white persons of good character. What does that tell you about the founding? That was the idea of America. And then to say, well, okay, suddenly it's open to the whole world. And so long as they come and they work hard, it doesn't make any difference. If they're Hindus or they're Somalis or Guatemalans, it doesn't make any difference. That is a radical departure from the way America was founded and what Americans took for granted. And to me, quite frankly, it makes no difference if immigrants are 10 feet tall, twice as smart as I am, twice as productive. It is my country built by my ancestors with their heritage in mind, wanting to have their own destiny in their own hands. They did not want to give it away to people, even if they were infinitely superior to them. And of course, I would argue that in many cases, many people coming across the border do not make substantial contributions. So there we have a completely alternative view of what America should be. It's not simply a group of individuals trying to improve per capita GNP. That to me is not a nation. That might be a corporation, but it's not the way real human beings think.
So yeah, one thing I appreciate about you, Jared, is you set the economic arguments aside. You will often hear from immigration restrictionists that it's not about GDP, but then they will go and make economic arguments. And then I said, well, just told me it's not about GDP, so
Right.
it's a thing. I like the honesty here because I can't believe that in economic terms, deporting 40% of the STEM STEM talent would not be an economic would not hurt us economically. So I'm glad we
Well,
can.
people who would be immigration restrictionists, they can certainly point to examples in which the newcomers are not contributing
Sure,
economically,
absolutely, you could.
and
Yes.
they might as well do so. And on balance, if you include the Silicon Valley CEOs as well as the border hoppers who turn out to be racist and murderers, on balance, is it good for the country in terms of GDP? I don't know. It may end up being a wash. But as I said to you before, in my case, even if it means a lower standard of living for my people, my European stock, that is a very much a price I'm willing to pay for the survival of a feeling of a nation that has fellow feeling, trust, a sense that they are part of something greater than themselves and not simple atomized cogs in an economic wheel. I think that's no way for people to live. And I think that to the extent that the United States is becoming that, people are losing hope. They're not having children. They're committing suicide at high rates. They're taking drugs. Where does this come from? I think it comes from the fact that they are not feeling the kind of rooted cultural warm attachment, not just to their family, but to the entire group, their community, their nation. And this kind of fellow feeling, I believe, is possible only among people who have a kind of past in common and who anticipate likewise having a future in common, not just any random mix of high IQ, hardworking people.
Yeah. So Yeah, okay, so I agree with you to a certain extent that some people do have a racial instinct. That's true. They want to be around people who are culturally, linguistically like themselves. I don't know about birth rates going down because of too much diversity. I mean, South Korea should have, one of the highest birth rates in the world. In that case, it seems like a universal
Yes,
problem. America is probably
yes,
better than most other white countries. Um, but yeah, okay. So this is a real thing. I just would probably quibble with you on its importance given people's real preferences. Now, you have people, they're hopping the border, they're coming to America. All those people, maybe all else equal, maybe a person from Guatemala prefers that people speak Spanish and look like themselves. But America has a much higher GDP. That's wealth. That's living your life the way you see fit. They come over here. I think if America bordered a country that was completely culturally different, and the GDP gap between us and that country was like between Guatemala and the U.S., I think we would immigrate there. I mean, I think that most people do care mostly about wealth, and to the extent that they do have racial instincts, I mean, they should be able to act on those. I mean, neighborhoods do segregate based on race. It's not
yes.
infinite. It's if a neighborhood is turns Asian, it's not like the home prices. No, whites won't pay anything for it, right? Whites will pay for it, right? They want to be areas free of crime. They want to be areas that are safe, and they want to be clean. They want to be around people of their own race, but it's just like one factor of many. And so it seems to me like your position is just saying we're not going to do this cost benefit analysis. We're not going to say, okay, well, we heard, it's going to do this to the country, that to the country. All we care about is first and foremost maintaining the demographic balance, and then come what may. Like on what maybe that's your preference, but on what basis? I guess like how do you either force people or convince people that they should have these preferences? However
No,
you would
no,
classify it.
I don't force them at all. I don't force them at all. And other people come to this country with those preferences built in. And we can do hardly anything about it. And we used to try to suggest to them, look, if you come to America, your primary interest has to be that of America. Teddy Roosevelt talked about how, no, 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 we're not going to have hyphenated Americans. We're not going to have Italian Americans, Hungarian Americans. We are all blue-blooded, America-loving Americans. Nobody even tries that anymore. And just for fun, you were proposing that we talk about Indians. Well, Indians in the United States. And it turns out when Indians make a whole lot of money, they do become philanthropists. But I looked up the top 3 Indian philanthropists. And guess where they give their money? They give their money to organizations that are good for Indians or good for development around the world. They still have that kind of blood and soil loyalty to India that you are suggesting they should abandon. In other words, all the people who are coming here, almost without exception, if you look deep enough, if you scratch hard enough, they have not left behind their old loyalty while they live here for a higher standard of living. I remember some years ago, it must have been, maybe 15 years ago, the World Cup final for the women's soccer team was played in California. And on one of the first occasions ever, the nationalist Chinese community and the Taiwanese community got together and rented seats together so they could all get together and cheer for the Chinese team. Here they are, Americans. Here they are, Chinese of different groups who despise each other on this one occasion living in the United States so they could root for the Chinese team. This tells you where their loyalties lie. And I frankly do not want to live in a nation in which the people who are loyal in some vague way towards the founding nation, the founding stock, the Constitution, the flag, for those people to eventually be reduced to a minority by people who do not share those sentiments. I think that is the most natural, normal feeling in the world.
I mean, the nature of this evidence, though. I mean, okay, some people got together in a soccer stadium. They cheer for the Chinese team. Is that
That's right.
most? Is that? But is that most Chinese Americans? I think we would need some polling or some data on that. I mean, every day I
Look,
see, you will see. Asian Americans playing on American Olympic teams. You'll hear the headlines will be if one goes because they have some because they have a blood relation because they have a blood kind of thing where they can go and they can play for the Chinese team. I've heard of that happening once in a while, but
Of course.
I would be surprised if if there are
I
more
bet you.
Chinese
Look,
Americans playing for China than there are for America. I mean, it seems like a
the
selective use of evidence here.
I think people's true loyalties come to the fore when there are international competitions. And it would be fascinating, and I think I would win hands down if you queried all of the immigrants to the United States, first, second, and maybe even third generation. If they're Mexican immigrants, who do they root for when the American soccer team plays the Mexican soccer team?
Okay,
This bespeaks a real attachment. These are real things, Richard. And
okay.
you can't build a nation in which there's real fellow feeling, trust, the idea that we are in this together with people whose loyalties are so divided.
Okay, I would be shocked. Maybe first generation, maybe. They
Oh,
would cheer for they would cheer for the foreign team. I would be shocked if a second generation Chinese or Mexican, on average, cheers for their ethnic team. Oh,
I wouldn't be
okay.
shocked at all. You know,
All we have is our guesses. We don't have neither of us has a survey on on hand. But yeah, that would be very interesting.
it's like
Maybe
as I
New Century Foundation should sponsor something like that.
well,
We
you
have to
know, it
commit
was
to
I
either
I
way, reducing the results. Yeah.
I can't remember what year it was, but Pew did a very, very interesting survey of first, second, third generation Hispanic immigrants. And of course, first generations, overwhelmingly, they identified not as Americans, but as Argentines or Guatemalans or whatever it was. And then the second generation, less so. And then by the time you get to the third generation, the fourth generation, their number one identification was not American, it was Hispanic. They still clung to being something different. And that's why you have the Hispanic Congressional Caucus. These people, how long have they been here? I don't know how many generations. They've been to American colleges, American universities, but they're still overwhelmingly in Hispanic caucus because that's where their interests explicitly and openly lie.
So does it bother you when speaking of Hispanics in Congress when when a senator from say West Virginia or Alaska they go and they put the interests of West Virginia or Alaska first? Does that mean they're less American if they want to get the pork to come home and they care less about the country relative to their own state? Is that necessarily inconsistent with American identity?
It is a state identity. That's the way our nation was set up from the beginning. As you no doubt know, the whole idea of federalism was that the federal power, the federal government, was to be this distant, really irrelevant part in the lives of Americans. And in fact, up until, oh, certainly the Civil War, the only contact most Americans had with the federal government was the U.S. mail. There was no federal income tax. This is part of the idea that America is composed of states. Each state is the one where the texture of life is set. The way we think about all aspects of life are basically set at the state. And over the generations, the central government has absorbed all the powers that used to be part of the state. I don't often quote Mao Zedong, but when it comes to federalism, I believe in the idea that let 100 flowers bloom. Let each of the states try to work things out in ways that suit them. That is the traditional way of working in America. Now, I think there is a legitimate argument. Should there be that kind of state chauvinism, or should there not be? But I think the fact that so many Americans have traditionally thought in terms of their state goes to show you how difficult it is to have these abstract, larger loyalties of a political kind. Our loyalties tend to be parochial. And when those loyalties are asked to cross not only state lines or national lines, but racial lines, you're asking people to do something that I believe is wholly unnatural and one of the most difficult things to ask of people to do. is to consider people who are visibly different. It's hard enough talking to people who are religiously different, linguistically different, but race is a biological characteristic. And I know we're supposed to think it's some sort of sociological optical illusion, but to then think, no, no, we are going to ignore this, appearance differences, behavioral differences, average IQ differences, and all hold our hands and sing Kumbaya and be Americans. I think that is as much a misreading of human nature as it is to build communism on the assumption that people can be taught to live from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. It was a beautiful idea. It sounded wonderful. It attracted great idealism, and of course, it resulted in immense slaughter, and it finally failed. After being on the road to nowhere for decades, I believe this idea of building an America in which race can be made not to matter is just as much a foolish misreading of human nature as communism was.
So, everything exists in degrees. So when you say there's a racial instinct and sometimes people care about their race more than the country, the question is, how much does this matter in the grand scheme of things? So I live in Southern California. Recently, I lived in a city which was 90% either Hispanic or Asian. And whites were about 10% of the population. So I live in an area that's very, very Asian, very, very Hispanic. There's, as you can imagine, socioeconomic differences where the Asians are much more likely to work white collar jobs, and the Hispanics are more likely to work blue collar jobs.
Hmm.
And the kids go to school together, and the Asian kids tend to do better on standardized tests, and they tend to get
Of
better
course.
grades and to go better colleges, and so forth. And the politics of Southern California. I mean, I wrote an article about this during the Floyd riots of 2020. We had basically Black Lives Matter protests. We had in Pasadena City, which is like 5 to 10% blacks. I mean, the politics for a while became about black people. California has a reparations commission, even though California is less than 10% black, and if you just go to the schools here, if you just read the local newspaper in LA County, race is not salient. Now, is there some city councilman? There was one guy who was arrested for a suspicion of being a Chinese foreign agent. So that happens once in a while, right? Will you find some uh, city councilman or some county commissioner who sends a grant to the Chinese community rather than rather than judge these things fairly and objectively and care about the whole community? I'm sure that happens. But in the grand scheme of things, you could go through your whole life here living in Southern California, be surrounded by Asians and Hispanics, only hear about blacks, see a few blacks, and only hear about blacks politically on the news. And it's just not a big, part of government. So
But
I used to
Richard,
read,
Richard,
yeah,
you just contradicted yourself. Here, this state that never practiced slavery and joined the
yeah, they're obsessed
Union.
with blacks. It's a black
Yes,
issue. It's not
it's well,
a
but wait,
demographic issue. It's not a general
the
diversity
state
issue.
the state has made it an issue. The state has been struggling or celebrating in favor of Black Lives Matter, despite the fact that there weren't any blacks around to lead that. Who led that? Who leads that foolishness in California? It's certainly not the Asians and the Hispanics, is it? It's the idiot white people who take a state in which blacks are a tiny percentage, and if there were to be reparations paid to blacks, the larger part of it would come from Hispanics and Asians, for heaven's sake. It is only white people who are cuckoo in that respect. And so I'm not at all surprised that you can live among Asians and you can live among Hispanics, and the race doesn't come up.
Right.
Certainly, Black Lives
Why
Matter.
are you a white advocate? Why aren't you an anti-black advocate? Because you seem to be
No, no,
admitting that, yeah, you
it's
know Ron
because
Unzi's theory about white nationalism, right? About how basically they have a lot of issues with black Americans. They overgeneralize. It's politically incorrect to talk too much about black issues. We probably are not often accused of being too politically correct, Jared, but I think that's Ron Unzi's critique, and they think it's safer to
well,
say you're a white advocate rather than a anti-black advocate.
well, it's because white people are the only folks in the world who are willing to sacrifice their interests so willingly for people who are, if anything, someone to who that would owe us. If you take blacks living in the United States today and compare them with how they would be living if their ancestors had been left in Africa, if their ancestors before them had not even sold them deliberately into slavery, they would be vastly worse off. And yet they come to us and they complain, well, we don't live as well as you do. That's because of slavery. Forget about time preferences.
But you're still
Forget
complaining
about
about blacks. I'm trying to
what?
get you to
No,
complain
no,
about other races.
no, no, no. I'm complaining about white people. Don't get me wrong. I'm complaining about the idiocy of white people falling for this kind of exploitation. White people are the only people who would fall for this kind of manipulation.
So
Now, I'll
so
give you
Asians, I
another
mean, but
example.
Asians support
What's
Democrats, don't they? I mean,
they?
Asians vote
Well,
Democrat. They're discriminated
they.
against in
I'm
college
sure.
admissions.
I'm sure that there would be almost no Asians who would actually vote for reparations for slavery in the state of California. Only idiot whites would do this. And as far as my white advocacy is concerned, my target audience is not black people, Asians, Hispanics. It is white people who get led around by the nose by these insane ideas. Let me give you a different example. I know that you think diversity is good for America, economically, morally, etc. Now,
Oh.
imagine that you went to China and you said, hey, you Chinese, not a bad country you have here. But you know what the problem with your country is? Too damn many Chinese. You need more diversity. You need to ginger the place up. You know, Somalis are good. Pakistanis are good. You know, a few
I mean,
Malays,
I
few
don't see
million
the
of that. Wait,
Chinese Communist Party though as wisdom. I mean, as the fount of wisdom. Yes, I think they would not
wait.
say that. Right. I
Look,
mean,
look. There
y-
is no country in the world where you approached them and you said that, and they would not call for the men in white coats, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Vietnam, they'd call for the men in white coats and have you taken away to a rubber room if you talk to
well,
them
I mean,
that
it
way.
depends on how you
Only,
define it. Turkey has,
only
yeah. Go ahead, finish.
Of course, only white people can be manipulated in this absurd way to think that it's somehow virtuous to invite in people who will shove them off the entire stage of history. Only white people. And that's why when I'm talking about California, the people, I don't criticize Hispanics or Africans who want to come to the United States. It's great. They show up, they get affirmative action. Wow, maybe tomorrow it'll rain beer. What a great country. They hop the border, they get a free bus ride to New York, a free shelter, medical treatment. Wow, why not come? It is the white people, the people who ostensibly run this country. They are the idiots, and they are the people to whom I most want to convey obvious truths.
Yeah. Okay. So you didn't answer the question about a matter of degrees. So first of all, the idea that only white people will vote against their interests or have be manipulated in a certain way. You look at the groups that are most the pro-Palestine groups, the ones who have some of the most prominent protests, often led by Jews. There is a Jewish left in Israel. It's not as big as
Yes,
in
there is.
America or Europe. Asians
Yes, there is.
vote Democrat. There, you'll find a lot of them in the diversity bureaucracy because they're subject to the same kind of sort of woke brainwashing that whites are subjected to, and Asians often take it up. So I don't believe that this idea that Asians are incapable of being brainwashed the way white people are to have all these woke ideas and to have affirmative action. Look, the Asians are starting to open up their borders in Japan, in Korea. I
with
don't think that
with
there's any.
with great hesitation. There is enormous resistance throughout all levels of those societies, and they're doing it only because, in the case of Japan, because of an excess of deaths over birth, they're losing 1 million people or more every year. That's a nation in extremis. They know very well that they are playing with fire, and they're doing it with enormous regret. And as you probably know, they are trying to do something that no society has yet succeeded in and increase the birth rate with all kinds of encouragement and subsidies. This is the great tragedy of all high IQ societies. We're not reproducing ourselves. And this is a separate problem. I recognize it as a terrible dilemma, but you don't solve it by replacing your own people with people who are never going to respect you anyway.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, in the end, the result is potentially the same. So Japan, I think I heard Tokyo, something like 10% of young people are foreign born, and so it is happening. And then you have, like Turkey has really opened up the floodgates to Syrian refugees. You might say, well, they're both Muslims, but they're a different ethnic group. So there are
Well,
analogies you could
they're
find
trying
there.
to send them. They're trying to send them back
They are
too.
trying to send it back. That's true. I
Yeah.
mean,
Mhm.
you do have Hispanics in America who are big MAGAs, and you, Jared, might say, well, that I wouldn't expect that. But now, something like 40% of Hispanics vote for Trump, the guy who runs on the idea that we have to deport all these immigrants, and being his, the subtext is that we have to remain a white country, being, all these
Mm.
Hispanics
No,
are
no.
damaging our
Uh,
country. You don't think that's
no, that's
the
that's
subtext
not
of
the
the
subtext at
Trump?
all. No, no, no.
Either way, you would predict
Yes.
that the Hispanics would want the country to be more Hispanic.
Yeah.
Apparently, many of them don't. 40%, whether it's 40%, whether 50%. So your idea is that this is like sort of baked into human nature, and I think it is to a certain extent. And I think it's to a certain extent. Yes, whites are more subject. You call it pathological altruism. I would consider it
Yes.
morality. I mean, I think that whites are prone to morality in a good way. I think that's a strength of America. I think that's a strength of the West. But this
Yeah.
idea that it's
Well, wait.
all, sort of Hobbesian, and you could predict people's views based on their ethnic background, and like we really can't get along, and this experiment is like as doomed to fail as communism. Like I think this is just taking something real and exaggerating it.
Well, if it's real, it doesn't need to be exaggerated, does it? And why should we dice with the future of the country? Maybe it will work out. Maybe we will all hold hands and sing kumbaya. I don't think so. Why should we even take the risk, even if it's going to increase GDP per capita? To me, the candle is not worth the game. No, that's not a legitimate trade off in my view. I mean, this may be a concept that's alien to you. But I am part of a people that stretches back to Greece, to Rome, that has this wonderful heritage. And we built it, and we have, I think, an obligation to preserve it forever by means of passing it on to our children and to their children. And this can be done successfully only in a territory that I believe is exclusively and permanently, at least a majority, ours. It's a very simple concept. And I would suggest, again, that practically every group in the world feels that way about the songs their ancestors sang, their religion, their language, their literature. There is a deep loyalty here that is part of human nature that you're trying to deny. Now, it may be possible to suppress it to some degree. Remember, Yugoslavia was under Tito for how long? Maybe under the communists for what, 40 years all told? And as soon as communism fell, it it just burst into all these separate groups because despite having been repressed all those decades, Serbs are Serbs, Croats are Croats, Bosnia-Herzegovinians, they are Bosnia-Herzegovinians. This is part of human nature, and we must deal with Homo sapiens as we find him, not as you perhaps would wish him to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think humans are much more deracinated than you might actually think. And some people will use this as an insult, but I think it's actually true. Look, you go to a lot of foreign countries, and you will find that the Germans and Northern Europeans, they're into like American culture, right? They're into American politics. They wear a lot of the similar clothes. Steve Jobs. It's the Steve Jobs biography with Walter Isaacson says the Jobs tells a story where he was in some Turkish play. He was in Turkey, and they were saying, "Well, Turkey is the one. We make coffee here in a certain way that nobody else in the world makes this coffee." And then Jobs says, "I was thinking to myself, who gives a shit? I walk outside, I see these Turks. They're wearing the exact same shirts. They have the exact same devices. They're listening to the exact same music that I see back in America." And I think this is like, there is like a kind of pre-assimilation here. And so, when you talk about like there is empirical evidence we can look at. Pat Buchanan, about a decade ago, 14 years ago, I think, I edited his book, Suicide of a Superpower. The subtitle, Will
Mhm.
America Survive Until 2025? Here we are, 2025. And I used to read Buchanan, and I would read American Renaissance, and I would read VDare and all these websites, and they made certain predictions. They made predictions about the future, and they basically said we'd see ethnic separatism with Hispanic immigration. We would see the country riveted apart, and this didn't happen. And at the same time, when I moved from Chicago to Southern California, Ron Unz said, "You might be surprised. You might have one idea of how racial issues work in America, but when you get to Southern California, you might see it's actually not that way." And I think Unz was pretty much correct. When we had 2020, when we had the riots with George Floyd, it was the exact same. You could have pulled up these headlines 1990, 1960. You go back to these stories in 1960. A black man is killed by a police officer, usually in the midst of committing some crime.
Mhm,
They riot in the streets. Some liberal comes out and says, "Well, we have to invest in the community, so on." So they have affirmative action.
mhm,
There's a black
mhm.
backlash among whites. This was American culture, and this was happening in the late 1960s. This was happening in the early 1990s with Rodney King, which you remember all that very well, I'm sure. And this is still the case in 2020. And so
Exactly. It hasn't gotten any better.
it's a black, but it's a black issue. We've changed the demographics of
Well,
the country from 90% white to 60% white,
yes,
and we are
yes.
still having the exact same discussions. It would be interesting. It would be a different world if there was a separatist Hispanic movement in Arizona and there was a Chinese
Uh,
separatist movement in San Francisco. That could have been a reality. Reading Pat Buchanan in 2005, that's what you think would have happened, but that didn't
well,
happen.
well,
They
true. It's true. There are
right.
still chapters of Mecha in practically all of the universities in the
Yeah.
Southwest. I can't remember.
I
That's
would have
movie
never heard of it
Viviente.
except for people like you and Buchanan, though.
Well,
That's the thing.
well, they're
It's
still around.
sure.
Movimiento Estudiantil de Azatlan or something, but it has not taken off in the way that it threatened to at one time. And certainly, one can toy with the idea that were it not for the black problem, and there is an intractable black problem in any non black country that has a substantial black population, this intractable problem. Were it not for this, then race would not be as salient, certainly, as it is today in the United States. And you could even make the argument, I think, that if the only multiracial experiment you had in mind was a mixture of, say, East Asians and Caucasians, you probably would have a kind of modus vivendi. At the same time, I don't want any of that either. And I will tell you why. And this may seem to you to be a kind of a romantic cop out almost. But first of all, I believe in true diversity. I want India to remain Indian. I think it would be a terrible shame if the last Hopi or the Navajo stopped being able to speak their own language. All these things are beautiful in their own way, just as Japanese culture everyone accepts, even Papua New Guinea, for heaven's sake. They like the way they behave, even though we may think they are savages. All of these things are beautiful to their own people. And if the United States became a nation in which there were this kind of rainbow hued cosmic race, as the Hispanics like to call themselves, what does that ultimately mean for white people? Ultimately, white people will disappear. We will be genetically swamped. We're only, what, 8 or 9% of the world population, having maybe 4% of the world's babies. Even if it were simply a matter of the aesthetic loss to the world of the disappearance of white people, I think that would be a tragedy. And of course, to me, it's not merely that at all. Europeans have created a civilization, a culture. They have created the modern world. They have done things that no other race did. And I believe that it's only the biological descendants of that group that are going to carry that heritage forward in any meaningful way. It would be like saying, okay, all the Japanese have disappeared. They've been replaced by Filipinos. Well, you're going to find a few honkies who do tea ceremony. You're going to find a few who actually do kendo or karate. Does that mean Japanese culture survived? No. It requires Japanese people. And it may be a long term process, but the way we're going, there will no longer be white people, Europeans, to carry forward that tradition. Again, this is my extended family. And to me, the extinction of my family is vastly, vastly more horrifying to me than my own death. Call me a romantic, call me irrational, but that is the way I am, and that is the way increasing numbers of white people are, whether you like it or not, Richard.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if that was true, I mean, Jared Taylor, I think, would be one of the most popular politicians in the country. Um, there,
Well, well, first of all, of course, it's hard to think of someone who has been squelched more systematically than your servant. I used to
yes,
have a wonderful YouTube channel. Gone.
true,
I can't have a Facebook account. I
true,
can't have an Instagram account.
yeah.
Oh, I really can't have an X account. Well, I sort of do now. All of this. Now, why is it? Why am I such a threat, Richard? Why am I so dangerous? Why are people
Yeah.
so terrified?
Well,
I,
I
you know,
mean, I never liked that argument because they suppress all
which
kinds of
argument?
people. It doesn't mean that they're
Yes, they do.
necessarily correct. I do think
Why
there is
me?
more.
Why me?
I think the Trump era has proved there's more of a market for your ideas than many people would have thought. But look, even if you took over conservatism, you would still be 50% of whites. I mean, you still would
Look,
have to deal with the fact that half of the
look.
your fellow white Americans will not agree with you.
That
And
may very well be. But do you know what percentage of the colonialists at the time of the Revolutionary War were really active in trying to start the revolution?
it's quite small,
Maybe,
yes.
maybe 30%, maybe 30%. It doesn't take all that many. Besides which, you say, well, I think you're actually being pretty generous. If I ran the media in the United States, I think that very soon millions and millions and millions of whites would agree with me because already millions do, despite all of this suppression. Despite it all, I'm speaking to an aspect of white people that has been very, very diligently suppressed, but is there to some degree. And I don't think it's all that difficult to reawaken a sense of attachment. As you know, the younger generation in the United States, people of all races, they feel lost. They feel detached. People of my children's generation, many of them will say, what's the purpose of living? Well, the purpose of living is these larger attachments that go beyond their own little petty requirements. And the idea of starting with a family. You know, when people are on their deathbeds and they talk about what meant the most to them, are they going to talk about their first million, that Lamborghini that they bought? No. What matters to them are their children and their grandchildren and their great grandchildren and the human attachments they had, what they were part of that's larger than themselves. And in America, increasingly, the message is nothing matters except you and your selfish interests. And people cannot live that way. Even the Bible, man does not live by bread alone. There are other things going on, and we have to take that into consideration.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that just because they don't have a racial identity, people are necessarily living atomized lives. Maybe they do, but I don't. But a lot of people have churches, a lot of people have communities, a lot of people just
Yes,
have ideals that aren't
that's true.
necessarily your ideals. I think that the problem here, is you're trying to speak for whites and their attachment. You're trying to sort of awaken them to something, I guess,
Yes,
to sort of, it is partly it's partly you think that these sort of instincts are suppressed, and it's partly
yes,
that you want to awaken these instincts even if they're not suppressed. You want to sort of spread them. And I think that honestly, I think that I think going for nation. Well, first of all, it's too late. I mean, Japan thing, you can preserve Japanese nation at this point if you close the
yes.
borders tomorrow. Kids who are children these days, I think whites are maybe 50% or maybe less. Even white American groups
Oh,
contains a
God.
lot of Middle Easterners and Jews and
Mhm.
so forth.
Yeah, right, right.
So it's an issue of scale, and I think that trying to think of America as a white nation at this point. I mean, it's like trying to think of Brazil as a white nation. I mean, would that make any sense?
Well,
I don't think it. I don't
well,
think it would.
well, no,
Um,
I agree. I agree. The idea of
okay.
taking America back. I remember, it must have been about 20 years ago in the pages of American Renaissance. We had this debate. Is it possible to take America back, so to speak? And even then, even then, 20 years ago, I would have been willing to say, okay, you draw a line right down the middle of the country, and you non-whites take whichever side you want. We'll accept the rest. I don't think that it's practical, nor is it moral, to turn the United States into an all-white country. To me, the way forward in America today is for the government to get out of this idea that people must mix, 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 mix. Let people separate. I've always been in favor of voluntary separation, strictly voluntary. I don't want to
Yes.
kick anybody out of anywhere. But I think if people are left to their own devices, they will choose the people with which they have the most obvious affinities. And one of the most obvious affinities is race. This is something that you could achieve by having much greater local autonomy and perhaps eventually a certain amount of sovereignty. I'm not talking about turning the entire United States, all, what is it, 350 million, 60 million? No, no, no. There's just no way you could practically do that. No way you could do it morally. I'm just talking about letting white people who wish to go their own way in peace and try to redevelop an outpost of self-conscious Europe here on the North American continent. That's all I ask. And you would think, given the opprobrium directed towards whites, we are these evil people constantly tormenting non-whites. We are the source of this white supremacist miasma that kills any kind of initiative elsewhere. You'd think that everybody else would be happy to see us go. Bye bye. Okay, you can have a certain place. Go ahead and be wicked altogether.
Yeah.
No, we're not even allowed that.
So
Somehow,
we
even
so
if
we
whites
agree
wish to do
we
it.
agree so then we agree, Jared. I, as you know, wrote a book on civil rights law. I believe in complete
Yes,
freedom of association on first principle. And
yes,
look, I mean, you have groups like the Amish who are able to,
that's
preserve
right.
their culture, and they're, a small, tiny percentage of the American population. Now, I think that maybe, so what do we disagree on then? Maybe the immigration issue. You want this, you
Yeah,
want
we
to,
definitely
freeze the
disagree.
borders and
Yes,
let people do what
yes.
they want within America. Now, what if the people of California say we love diversity and we want a lot of Chinese? I mean, there's going to be parts of America that see it as part of their culture and they're part of expression of their moral values to welcome people from across the world. Should they be allowed to do
I
that?
say no, I say God bless them. God bless them.
Okay,
If
so
people if people
you
if people
uh,
really want to mix it up, I think when push comes to shove, Koreans go to Korean churches because not because they don't speak English, it's because people want to worship this emotional experience. They want it with their own people. No. So if they really want to mix it up, that's fine. Just don't condemn whites who don't want to mix it up. And just as even today, we don't condemn blacks or Hispanics or Korean churches or anyone else who wish to say, no, no, this for us, we like it this way, and sorry, but you are not welcome. Let's extend that opportunity to white people just like everybody else. And if in the meantime you want to fill the country with H-1B Indians, my answer to that is not no. My answer to that is hell no.
so Jared, we are mostly in agreement, except you don't want the H-1B, you don't want the H-1B Indians.
Well, I
I think
don't
that's
know.
right.
I don't know. I mean, I saw a headline of a piece you wrote. It was something like "Shut up about race and IQ."
Yeah.
Now, I think it is very important. You do something that's very important. You acknowledge these racial differences in IQ. And the idea of, okay, first of all, we're going to build a multiracial country and we're going to pretend that those differences don't exist. There could be no better prescription for failure than that. We have all these differences in achievement, and what's the default explanation? Wicked white people. And
Yeah.
one of the obvious points of white advocacy is to say, no, really. I mean, it may be unpleasant to talk about that standard deviation gap between average black and white IQ, and Hispanics are also somewhere in the middle. It may be unpleasant, but we better talk about that out of pure self-defense. And simply talking about that will get you kicked off of YouTube. What kind of
Yeah.
country is that?
Yeah. Okay.
This
So
is just
yeah.
insane.
So yeah. So the the IQ differences is obviously something that's very relevant to public policy. But the
Right?
idea. Wait. I thought you said, first of all, I thought you said they can have the Indians. You just want the
What
Indians.
do you
We
mean?
have to have sort of a separatism. We have to have an America broken up into, I don't know, states, counties, whatever, where you could have your white area. And you could have freedom of association. Presumably, the states
Well,
would be able to exclude people from other states. So, like Texas can exclude Oklahomans and so forth.
at some level, perhaps, but I don't think for the most part they would have to. Certainly, no white area would have to deliberately exclude people, at least according to current thinking. If there were areas of the country, locally autonomous, full of white people with a racial consciousness, everybody from every other race would think, oh my gosh, these people are knuckle dragging, cross burning, snaggletooth horrors, all armed to the teeth. They wouldn't even think of moving there. Now, eventually, it would become clear that those places populated by whites, had very low crime, a lot of social trust, all kinds of public benefits, and they would begin to attract others. Yes, we would have to have the right to say, no, thank you, this is for us and for our children. Yes. But in the meantime, look, let us face it, the United States was built by my ancestors. It's all very well to say blacks built the wealth of America. What a bunch of absurd hooey that is. And the Chinese worked on the railroads. What a bunch of hooey. We actually had horses working hard in America, but they were told where to go and what to do by white people. So my ancestors built this country. They didn't build it for people who were not white. They built it for people like me. It's very clear from the founding document. Now, I'm not saying I want it all back. All I'm saying is let's stop the dilution of the country and let's work out some sort of amicable separation that gives the founding stock an opportunity to refashion things in a way that's going to be permanent. You may
Yeah.
laugh all you like, but these ideas are going to become increasingly popular. They are increasingly popular because
I,
ultimately they are moral, Richard. Ultimately,
I,
they are absolutely moral, and
Jared,
they're
yeah,
in conformity with human nature and history.
yeah. I'm just laughing because I've just had the thought that there is a place where you can move, where there are many
I
communities you
don't
can
want to
move.
move. Well,
Well, I mean,
this is
people can.
my
Well,
country.
but no, you want to form a country. You want more. I mean, not in the other rest of the world, but you want to form a country where people basically have their own communities and they break off and they have these different cultures. And if you want a completely white existence, you can have that. There is a state called West Virginia that's 95% white. There are parts of it where
Yeah.
you'll never see an Italian, much less a black person, and if this racial instinct was as strong as you say, people would move there. Now, if we got what your dream, and you had basically areas that were white ethnostates, and you had basically other whites being able to go elsewhere, this would make. I mean, this would be the gap in living standards between the whites who would choose to live around other whites and the people who would live to choose around diversity would be massive. And I think you know that, and I think that they would probably have other
Well,
problems. The people who chose diversity, they would have probably street crime. They would probably have maybe homeless people sleeping in alleys. But the wealth produced by the tolerant whites, along with elite human capital from the other races, would be so overwhelming that I think even a lot of your whites who pick the homogenous community would want to go there. I mean, the idea that this would be like a utopia if like ethnocentric whites formed their own place. We have
well,
that to a certain extent, West Virginia. I don't know why you would think it would be different if it was more explicitly on that basis.
let's talk about Orania. You're familiar with Orania, of
Oh
course,
yes, I am, and it's got what, like 3,000 people or so.
and a huge waiting list of people who want to come in.
Okay,
It's
so
very,
what's
very.
huge? What's huge
What's that?
out of how many people in
Hmm?
South Africa? Out of
Well,
how many
it
whites in South Africa?
it's it's
Um,
it's it's a start. It's a start, and
uh,
it is. There's a huge waiting list because of the enormous amount of social trust. I agree. West Virginia is a strange problem. It is full of white people, but some of the lowest grade white people I believe I've ever seen
oh
in my
no,
life.
Jared, you're gonna get in trouble.
Yes. Oh, no, 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 no. I don't disagree. We are not all superior human capital. And I remember I spent a couple of days in the capital of West Virginia. Let's see, Charleston, West Virginia. And after walking around for a while, I thought to myself, boy, there must be a city ordinance that says in order to live in this city, you have to be fat and have a tattoo and smoke cigarettes. Really? Look, I'm not saying, I mean, like in all human groups, whites are on a bell curve, and somehow those at one unfortunate end of the bell curve seem to have ended up in West Virginia. Now, these are still my brothers and sisters, and I want to bring them along in as useful a way as possible. I want them to be the best white people they can possibly be, but West Virginia is not where the best ones are. Now, of course, it is a very hilly, unproductive place. All it ever had was coal to begin with, and people have moved out. But to point to West Virginia and say, okay, that's what it's going to be like for white people, no, wrong. And when white people start building their own intentional communities, you will see they will be very desirable places.
So we can, so yeah, we can put aside poor West Virginia. We don't have to keep picking on them. But
No,
even if you look at sort of population flows, right? There would be evidence for your worldview. That's what I'm saying. So the states that are gaining population, they tend to be Florida, Texas. It's the states that see better economic growth. Now, Florida and Texas are also growing non-white, like much of the rest of the country. There could be a world where Maine is also a very white part of the country.
yes,
We could say Maine
New
instead of West
Hampshire.
Virginia, where it's not so terrible. The whites there are not as terrible or not as
No,
terrible
no,
off as the whites in West Virginia. But
no.
people could choose to live in Maine. People could flow to Maine instead of
Well,
Florida, instead of Texas, instead of these states that are growing
yes,
economically
yes.
fast. And they don't. They move where the opportunities are. They move where the economies. I'm not saying there's no racial preference, but if you in any model of the world you balance racial instinct versus this kind of tribal instinct versus economic opportunity, traditionally measured by economists, you'll find that economic
Well,
opportunity wins every time when you're looking at just people's
and
revealed
Richard,
preferences.
Richard,
Yes.
when they move from California and they go to Texas, who do they live with? Just the other day, I discovered that in Houston, there are Islamic neighborhoods.
Yeah.
I was shocked by that.
Yeah.
I didn't
So
realize
they're,
there.
but they're
Now,
fun.
they don't.
Okay.
They're not moving there. They're moving to overwhelmingly white places. They're building their own little enclave to get away from diversity. And it's possible in a big state like Texas. It's possible even in a small state like New Hampshire. And of course, in Maine, you have these where were they from? Somalis living in Lewiston, Maine, who have their own little enclave. People clump together. And to say that they're going where there's economic opportunity, yes. They're going where the weather is good, yes. And where they end up is around fellow white people. Imagine an entire state that was like that. And that's where they would go in huge numbers.
Yeah. But maybe that's the ideal. Maybe the ideal is something like Texas or Florida, where you can have freedom of association in your neighborhood, and you can benefit from both the low wage labor. I don't think these people are completely parasites. I
No,
mean, I think Hispanic immigration do a lot of it, and high wage labor, and they just live in different neighborhoods and they organize like that. Why isn't?
not
Why
good
does it
enough.
have to be? Why do the Texans have to claim it all white just to feel psychologically secure? That they're happy going to Texas and Florida, living in a white neighborhood, but being in a mosaic of diversity. They're not choosing rural Nebraska
Because
or whatever.
because that's the best that's available now. And that's not good enough. That's really not good enough. I want white children to grow up in a country, to grow up in a school district that doesn't tell them they're dirt. And that is what America says today. White people are criminals. Columbus had to have 30 of his
Yeah.
statues
Yeah, we
torn
agree.
down.
I mean, Jared, there's a lot of,
No,
I
no,
mean, half
wait,
the country
wait.
agrees with you on that and half the country
Well,
disagrees. And this is a normal
eh,
political debate.
well,
It's not
okay. You can
It's not
call that
immigrants'
political.
faults that whites are
No,
taught this
no,
in
I
school.
agree. That's why I keep telling you. That's why I keep telling you. My message is to white people. I'm often called a hater, a hate monger. I don't hate these people who are coming to the country. I would probably do the same if I were they. Here you just come to this country that works. The police don't usually shake you down. The telephones work. And then you got all these free goodies. Why not come? The people that, if I were in the hating business, the people I would hate are the white people who have given away this magnificent birthright. Those are the people who are absurd. And that they have let in all of these intellectuals that then try to justify it and say, well, they're sort of morally required to do this. And all of these wonderful Indians you love, I could give you a whole handful of Indians who come to the United States. And what's this guy? He wrote a book about, what is it? This land is our land. This is an Indian guy. He says, immigration is a form of reparations for what has been wrought upon the global South. I claim the right to the United States by manifest destiny. Let me stop. No, no. We're here. We're not going back, and we're not going to let the bastards take it back. It's our America now. Now, this guy is wrote this. I could quote you 3 or 4 people who talk this way about the United States. Saira Rao, do you know who she is? She ran for
Oh,
Congress.
the dinners with white women lady.
Yes,
Yeah.
she ran for Congress 2018, and when she lost, her reaction was not, well, maybe I didn't run a good campaign, maybe my platform was no good. Her reaction was, well, I've given up on white people. And you read her tweets about what a vile country America is. who needs these people. And as you say, she makes a living having dinner with white people to tell them exactly how bad and awful they are, how every minute of the day they are supporting white supremacy, whether they believe it or not. Again, my message is not to her. My message is this idiot white women who put up with that. That is our great failing. And unless we get over it, we will just be pushed over the edge. Now, when I'm talking about the kinds of solutions I'm envisaging, I'm not necessarily saying it's got to be this way. All I'm saying is when more white people agree with me, and more will, now that I'm back on X, that things are going to change in ways that none of us can anticipate. When enough people begin to think the way my ancestors did and the founders thought, things will change in ways none of us can imagine, and things will be improved in terms of the future of my people. And I think this effort of mine is 100% legitimate and will ultimately succeed, like it or
You
not.
know, yeah. You know, Jared, my ideas are growing and our movement will succeed,
Yes.
it's sort of funny because you see sort of if you see like what online white nationalists or you see white nationalists in real life, um, a lot of Hispanics. I mean, the most famous among the Zoomer generation is a young man named Nick Fuentes, who is
Mhm.
Hispanic. You do have a lot of Indians. A lot of Jewish white nationalists. Um, it's to me, it's sort of I don't know. What do you make of that? Because to me, it sort of demonstrates. I'll tell you the way I see it. It sort of demonstrates to me the absurdity of the whole thing, and that American assimilation works so well that people either become rightoids, like they just buy everything, and even if they're brown, they'll like talk about like they'll be racist and they'll talk like white nationalists. They'll basically basically adopt a lot of your ideas. And if they're leftists, they'll just become leftists. You can have the whitest person in the world, they'll be a leftist. Maybe there's averages and who goes to what. So I see this as sort of like the fact that your movement, the people who agree with your ideas, are so I won't say overwhelmingly, but to a great extent, much more than people would have expected 5 or 10 years ago. Hispanics, Indians, non-white
No,
people.
name one Indian. Name me
Name
one
one Indian.
Indian. Yeah,
There's
who's
a
a
guy
real
named
white
Indian
advocate.
Bronson on Twitter who has a
Who?
100,000 followers. That's
Okay.
not nothing, but you see these people
Well,
all the time. I mean, it's
come on.
anecdotally. If you,
Well, okay. Look, I think you're confusing things.
Hispanics, at least, you'll agree there are a lot of Hispanic white
Not very.
nationalists.
I mean, Fuentes is mostly European. I don't know what his DNA is composed of, but I think if you were to see him, would you say, "Gee, this guy is probably Mayan or maybe it's Athabascan"? No, he looks largely European. And
Okay.
at this point, in any kind of racial consciousness movement, I don't think we're in the business of saying, "Oh, it's got to be blue-eyed and blonde." No, we're Europeans. That's the basic thing. I'm fairly latitudinarian about this, as you probably know. But I think you're confusing something. I get a surprising number of messages from people all around the world, mostly Chinese, subcontinental Indians, and some Africans. And they will say, "Mr. Taylor, what you're doing is vitally important. The world needs white people. Don't let your people be pushed aside." I think this is very touching. These people have a more accurate understanding of what Europeans have done in creating the modern world, all these wonderful institutions, all of these achievements that all the rest of the world cannot produce from themselves, and therefore they come benefit from them living with us. All these people recognize it far better than most whites, or many whites. This is
Yeah.
a very touching thing to me. And I think they're absolutely now that doesn't mean that they are, I don't know, you could not call them, they're white advocates in a sense, because they understand that white advocacy is a vital task, not just for us, but for the whole world. I'm not even saying that, although I believe it's true. I think that's pushing things a little further than a certain amount of decency requires. But this is something that is not to be confused with people who think they're white. They don't think they're white. They know they're not white. So you can't call them white advocates the same as the people who I would wish to make an ethnostate with.
Yeah.
You see
I
the
mean, when you
distinction
use
I'm
this,
making?
what's that?
You see this distinction I'm making?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's fair enough.
Yeah,
One thing when you talk about sort of whites built this and they built it for their ancestors and whites did that, I mean,
yeah,
there's no necessary reason. So, like, you look at the CEOs of the major tech companies. you
I
can't,
don't care.
exclude the present. You can't exclude the present from building the country, right? Because the tech industry has been basically the economic engine of the country for the last 30 years. And
Don't
to say that
overstate
a
it,
person
Richard.
in West Virginia, these fat
Mhm.
people, they built the country, while these Indians with someone like Jensen Huang did not. Um, why not just say individuals built this country? Because what is a white person who is not what is a white person
But
who is completely undistinguished, has done nothing particular in his life? Maybe his grandparents were indistinguished too. Maybe his grandparents were burdens on the state. Are we to give that
look,
person credit for building America more than a CEO of a
the,
Fortune 500
these
company today?
people These people are part of the family, Richard. And
That's
every family has its black sheep. I'm sorry. Your argument doesn't hold water. All
yeah,
of these CEOs, they are absolute Johnny come latelys. And I'm very glad if they're making good contributions. But don't forget all of these wonderful Indians of which you want more and more and more. They are the largest contributor of remittances outside the country now, even more than Mexicans. $25 billion a year, maybe $30 billion a year. All of these wonderful H-1B types, they're sending back to India. They're not spending it here. Doesn't that say something about their feelings about diversity, their feelings about national solidarity, their feelings about blood and soil? It goes back to India.
yeah. So
Yeah,
yeah, so
yeah.
a lot depends on the analogy to a family. I think when people have familial instincts, you don't have to convince them to take care of their families. I think the analogy breaks down. We actually have laws against nepotism because people are so overwhelmingly, willing to favor their families that we expect it as sort of a matter of course. But then you say, well,
What?
whites are not favoring their own race, and I've got to convince them
No.
otherwise. It's
No, they're
it's
not. And the people
yeah.
the people who are most ferociously nepotistic are not whites. This has been traditional in the development of white consciousness. All of these voluntary associations between whites, going back several hundred years, these Mannerboons, these people were associated voluntarily, not based on kin. We are not Arabs. We don't marry our cousins. We trust people even if they are not our direct kinfolk. There's something individual about white people, and that is one of our strengths, but it also makes us easy to divide and conquer. It's all part of the same thing here. Nepotism is not a problem in European societies. I mean, there are laws against it because it could be a problem, but it's nothing like what you would have in Oriental societies, Muslim societies, Latin American societies with all their sort of weird mixes of different races. No, it's part of something that we understand, but it's not in our nature the way it is in others.
Yeah. Okay. So, okay, I think we've sort
Anyway,
of hit the points. I think we've made our arguments.
okay. Well,
I
how long have we been? Oh, gee. Yeah,
about an hour.
I can be interesting for only about an hour.
Yeah, and me for not much longer. Jared,
Yes.
I appreciate your honesty. I appreciate your integrity with which you present these views, and your the civility with which we have these discussions. I don't agree with you. I mean, I think we agree with on a lot of things. I mean, on civil rights law and the craziness of
Yes.
wokeness and all that.
Yes.
But
Yes.
I do believe in liberal ideas. I do believe that race, while important from like a scientific perspective, does not have to. It's sort of a
Well,
self-fulfilling prophecy, the
well,
extent to which we give it importance
well,
in our
well, Richard,
politics. Yes,
Richard,
go ahead.
let me ask you a question. I know you say that diversity is good for America. Would you say it's good
Well,
for
not
every country?
diversity necessarily. No, no. I'm trolling a little bit when I say I'm going to debate Jared and tell him
Mm.
diversity is good. It's not necessarily that diversity
Hey,
is good. I think that the liberty considerations and the economic growth considerations are good for America. It's not
I,
necessarily that they speak a different language or eat different food or so forth.
well, wait. Are they good for every other country? I mean, should Malaysia have more diversity?
Well, yeah, yeah.
Should
They should open their borders. Yeah,
Israel
I
have more
believe in
diversity?
free trade and free movement of people. Yeah, I
Free
don't have any
everywhere,
illegal Americans.
everywhere. Wait. Okay.
Oh, you can look. You can have. I think that no, not everywhere. I think
No,
that
we're not.
there are. I
Who do
think
you
there are
spare?
issues with Muslims in Europe. I think there are unique. Like I'm
Yeah,
open to empirical evidence, so I could say that this is a unique issue. I don't. I so I
not a
do think.
unique issue. It's a typical issue.
No, because I don't think our Hispanics and our Indians are present a problem anywhere near to the extent that Muslims and Africans in some countries do in Europe. So it's
As
about
you
numbers. It's about the populations coming. It's
as you
about
like as you like to say, it's all a matter of degree.
absolutely, yeah.
But
It's numbers,
but
and
now,
it's specific to the situation.
what nations would you exempt from this endorsement of diversity, if there are
It
any
would
at all?
it depends on their circumstances. So I think
Yeah.
that I'm really open
Cite
to
one.
immigration restrictionism for Japan. I mean, I think because it is a
Oh, good.
homogenous country and a unique culture. I think America is when it's 45% white under 5. I don't think there is a homogeneity to preserve. I think America's
Oh,
destiny is to be big and dynamic and have economic growth and bring the people of the world together and give the world the greatest scientific and technological innovations. So countries
uh,
have there are different places in their history and they have different things to contribute
so
to the world. So
so
there, go ahead.
at what point would you have permitted us to remain homogeneous?
What do you
Because we
mean?
started off that way ideally. But now it's too
Um,
late, you're saying. You're saying the white man's days are over, give
no,
up.
no,
You're
I
saying,
think.
give up, white man. Of course you are. You're
Well, I
saying, hey,
think
it's
that
finished for you and your kind.
yeah,
We don't like to hear
it's
that.
I think I would probably still favor open immigration policy on net. I think it makes more sense in a 90% white country to advocate for this, to advocate
What?
for
Really?
maximizing the white population. It doesn't make sense in a
What?
45% white country because you've already introduced the diversity. You're already going to have these racial issues. And the only way you're going to have to figure out how to, you're going to have to figure out a sort of moral principles that everyone is going to be able to live by.
In other
What's the
words,
immigration debate right now? The immigration debate is whether we're going to be 53% white or 46% white in 50 years. In the end, I
so,
care more about what ideas we're gonna live by.
okay, so we are supposed to gracefully accept our decline, our
You don't have to decline.
minority status.
I want you
What?
to have 10 children each, Jared. I want you to have as many blonde hair, blue eyed babies as possible.
Well,
It's not a decline.
but
It doesn't have to be seen that way. It
a
can be.
decline, for heaven's sake. Any other group would consider it a
I don't care what other
decline.
groups. People think
And we
stupid
do
things. I
too.
don't care.
We do too.
It's
Look, you're
not.
saying the Japanese have the right not to decline. You'd
It's not
probably
about.
say the
It's not about.
Chinese have the right. You've
I
never,
think
you
that.
publish,
I,
but
I
no, white people, what European country doesn't, I mean, Germany was practically all German until just a few decades ago. Now it's benefiting marvelously from this wonderful diversity you prescribe, but at least you recognize these Muslims are not necessarily going down very well.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
acknowledge
How
that,
about
and so
France?
of
How
course
about
it's
Italy?
necessary. France, I
Yes.
mean, Italy. It depends on it depends on the situation. I think all of them could benefit
Oh,
from high
it
skilled
depends
immigration.
on
I think they
nothing.
could all benefit from more open labor markets and encouraging smarter people to come there. But no, there is and if people bring up Israel, and I would say the same thing with Israel. Obviously, when 90% of Gaza supports Hamas, you can't have open borders with the Muslim world, and Europe is somewhere in between. And America is a country where it's working. Jared, it's working. I live in Southern California. The liberals have some crazy ideas. They had COVID restrictions. It's not the immigration, it's not the diversity that's killing us. It's the stupid environmental laws where you can't get a paper towel, where you had to kids had to wear masks in school for two and
Wait,
a half years. They had the same
uh,
policies in Washington and Oregon, which are still probably 80 or 90% white.
wait,
It's
and
worked. The
that's
American
why.
experiment has worked.
Wait, it's because paper towels and masks, that's why so many thousands of whites are leaving California
Well,
and
no, the
going to
whites are
Oregon.
leaving because it's expensive, because people want to live in
And that's why
California
they're going
because
to
it's a great
Oregon. You
place.
just said Oregon and Washington were just as stupid. Why are these whites going there? It's because they don't like diversity. They don't like the fact that you have
No, I think people are
interpreted
moving.
the PTA meetings. They
Yeah,
don't like that.
I think people are moving from Washington and Oregon too. I mean, as we talked about before, people are moving towards where the economic growth is, and these. I think Washington actually is doing okay. Oregon,
Yes,
not
it's
so
doing
much.
okay.
But Washington
Yeah.
has no income tax,
Mm.
and I think that I think that matters more than its demographics for these kind of things. Um, but anyways, this was
All right.
fun, Jared. I enjoyed this a
Okay.
lot.
My pleasure.
And
My
yeah,
pleasure.
and we'll post this on we'll put for people who just came in late. We'll post this on Twitter later today, so people will be able to watch the whole thing.
Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you for this invitation,
My pleasure. Thanks, Jared.
and hope you have a very happy new year.
Yeah, likewise to you.